Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. Good to have you along again. Hi, Mike. Good to have you with me today. Today, we will be answering listener questions. In fact, we just have one question that I'd like to spend the whole episode talking about, and that is the creation of a Divine Council Worldview library, how to go through that issue of choosing books, what to read, what not to read. There's just a lot to talk about there, and it's one of my hobbies. In fact, it is my real main hobby is my library, I guess I'd say. And so I'm glad to talk about that issue when it comes to a Divine Council Worldview. Thanks again for your questions, everybody. If you have questions to send along, we'd love to handle them and send them to questions.dcwp at gmail.com. So good to have you along again, Mike. I know you're busy with school. I'm busy getting ready for the conference. The DCW conference is coming up in, October 8th and 9th. And my wife and I will be there. I'm excited about it. So looking forward to seeing as many people there as possible. Let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen with those that can see it. Here comes a question, and this really is starting with a question from Ed, is his name. And he said, I laughed aloud when Ron said he would get in line with others who wanted to share a conversation with C.S. Lewis in heaven. I have wondered, honestly, how we're going to share time with our spiritual heroes in heaven. I'm sure I get to someday talk to Lewis, but it might be a while. And then Ed said, that made me wonder if you had time to read this book, Case Study in C.S. Lewis. I have not read it, so that's a good question. That made me think about Lewis, of course. Let me say, going into this conversation about the development of a library, well, when it comes to C.S. Lewis, let me just jump in here. He is really one of my favorites to read. I discovered him in college. I'd say, sophomore year of college. I remember where I was sitting when I read my first Lewis book. And I think I've read almost everything he's written. And what I've found, I'm curious if you'd agree, Mike, he is an interesting case study for a DCW. Not that he ever met anyone who would claim DCW views, but when it comes to my top 10 books to read, I've listed here, Mere Christianity, just because it's such a standard, right? Screwtape Letters. There are several chapters within Screwtape Letters, which again is a fictitious account of a senior demon talking to a junior demon about how to handle a particular human who becomes a Christian in the book, and every chapter is devoted to a subject as to how to tempt that man away from God and towards Satan. And there's a lot of humor in it because we all say to ourselves, boy, that sounds just like me or my wife or whatever. And that's just, again, vintage Lewis in some senses. But what makes the book so helpful is he does have several instances in the book where, writing from England at the time, he proposes the idea through a demon or the voice of a demon, that the best way to tempt a human is not to reveal himself, but to be very silent, to be very quiet, to not reveal his reality. And I forget which chapter it's in, but he said, if we can get humans to think in terms of a force, capital F, and not real spirits, we've won the game. And of course, that reminds us of Star Wars. Much later even than Lewis himself. So he predicted the idea of the force as though that would be a means of suppressing the reality of spirits and instead heightening the concept just of this impersonal force that runs the cosmos. But anyway, I find that Lewis in many of his books uses the concept of deities, or even like in my favorite science fiction, Paralandra. We have deities in that book, and I find it very helpful. So I'll leave it there. But anything you want to say about Lewis? Do you read him much, Mike? Or
so it's kind of funny. Opinions? Like Mere Christianity, you said you met Lewis or you started reading his books during college. I think for the majority of Christians, at least when I was in college, that was when they also met Lewis. And I think I have a tendency to be. I hate to admit this, but I still actually have not read Mere Christianity from cover to cover. And I admit that because part of the response and the reasoning was because everyone around me in my church fellowships and college fellowship, everyone was reading Lewis. And then every other book that I would read from another Christian, nonfiction writer or Christian living, they would always quote Lewis, even especially from Mere Christianity. So it got to a point where I felt like I was reading Mere Christianity without actually reading Mere Christianity. Sure. And so I think that was part of why I was a little hesitant. I did read Screwtape Letters, and it was okay. I actually tried to read The Weight of Glory. I think I only got about halfway through it. But the one book that really caught my imagination was The Great Divorce. Mm-hmm. I think there was, at the time when I read it, it also was because there was a particular Christian band, Capeman's Call. They had a song that was called The High Countries. And when I was so in love with that song that I started trying to dig out what was the background and how did this song come about. And it turned out at the time, the married couple on Capeman's Call who wrote that song, they were reflecting on both The Weight of Glory and The Great Divorce. Okay. And so that was what intrigued me enough that then I picked up The Great Divorce. And I still think about that book every so often just because of the imagery, the imagination that Lewis kind of described. I really appreciated his concept of how the heavenly beings or the ones who are loyal to King Jesus, that they had ultimately these bodies that were more solid than solid.
Yeah.
Right.
And way of describing it.
Yeah. And it's just something about more real. Everything about the highlands or the high countries was more real. And those who were stuck in the Shadowlands, which is essentially another way of describing, a hellish like experience, they had no substance. They were shadows. And that even stepping on the grass in the high countries hurt their feet because the grass would pierce their feet. It was a very kind of like sobering, but also such an intriguing way to describe, in many ways, like the experience so many of us may feel about even just this everyday life. Mm-hmm. And kind of these like vain things that we become so fixated by that I actually was recalling a scene with a friend from church last week from Great Divorce. And it was this imagery of this red lizard that was on one of the traveling companions of the main character from the bus. I remember
that story too. Yeah.
And how ultimately he had to come to the decision of whether he would throw this stupid red lizard that's been on his shoulder and back for all his life, and to finally surrender essentially this addiction, this thing that has been keeping him bound up. And
it would keep biting him, and he would keep petting it. Remember that? It would bite him, and he petted it. It's a fascinating combination of hating it and loving it. I remember that.
Yeah, and how ultimately like this lizard was screaming of like, don't let that angel basically, it's going to, that thing will kill me. And the angel was like, yes, you're right. I will kill you, but you have to be willing to let go of it. I won't kill it without your permission. Yeah. Was like, wow. I mean, it's just like, it's, even though I know it was written so many decades ago, yet there is a relevance to what he imagined that still applies today.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't get enough of Lewis. I read him all the time in everything I can. I've noted on my slide here that anything by Walter Hooper, when it comes to biographies and books about Lewis, there's no end, of course, but anything by Walter Hooper, his personal secretary near the end of his life, and Douglas Gresham, not that they wrote a lot, but just if you ever see their name, Walter Hooper or Douglas Gresham, his stepson, that he received, that he got when he married Joy's son, Douglas. He became a godly Christian man, and he writes about his stepfather very lovingly. But yeah, thank you. The one thing, and I just want to pass this along to our listeners, I have the first 2 volumes of his collected letters. This is the most expensive one volume or one book I've ever seen anywhere is the third volume, The Collected Letters of C.S. Lewis, Volume 3. The lowest I've seen anywhere on the internet is half-price books for $250 for the book. I don't know why Volume 3 is so expensive, but if anyone's willing, this is very selfish on my part, Mike, but if anyone's willing to sell their Volume 3, I'm all ears. I have the first 2 volumes of his letters, but that third volume is when he becomes a Christian. I think that's why it's so expensive. Is it records or has his letters as written as a Christian. So thought I'd throw that out there if anybody wants to get rid of their version. Well, let's talk in the remainder of our time quickly here about the creation of a DCW library. And this is my opinion. I'm sure you have your opinion too, Mike, as to how to go about this. Dr. Mike Heiser had near the middle to the end of his ministry, he was very intent on creating a bibliography. And I remember him talking to me personally about this project that I think, did he have you work on it or someone I know was working on it? I forget who it was. But it was a separate project that he actually, gave to someone else to work on. And I don't think it was ever finished, but really the idea behind it was the collection of every book, article, every resource he could find that informed a DCW on whatever level. And of course, that really becomes a massive project, almost, I would say, unlimited, based on how a DCW mind, like yours and mine works. I mean, we're constantly adding things to our repertoire of what we need to know. So let me read this. Because a DCW is a way of reconstructing the conceptual world of the biblical writers, I would personally build a personal library outward from the Bible itself, rather than outward from DCW ideas. In other words, what I mean is, you could build a library based on Nephilim, or you start with a biblical or a DCW idea that you want to pursue. And you just, whether it be online, you start researching, or actually, going after physical books and things like that, or electronic resources, those kind of things. I'm finding that I'm better served by simply thinking of Scripture itself and building outward from there, and watch that bring into itself DCW ideas on its way. But you're not starting with the DCW and pursuing it. You're pursuing the Bible and finding that the DCW falls into line. So, for example, the unseen realm rests heavily on broad-ranging scholarship that often disagrees with DCW views. I think I have it here. Mike's expanded edition of the Unseen Realm has a bibliography. The regular edition does not have a bibliography in it. At least mine doesn't. The hardback that I had. And, of course, we're glad to see it. I mean, it's pages and pages. What is it? 50-some pages of books. Remember that most of the books that are listed here by Dr. Mike do not come from DCW people. I mean, many, many authors listed there are not fellow travelers on the Divine Council Worldview path. They help. Here's the point, though, to Mike. In the reason he listed a book in his bibliography is because he found it, whether it be a journal article or a book, helpful in the establishment of some issue as he was researching. So again, don't think that the bibliography means all these people have a Divine Council worldview. Most of them do not, frankly, but Mike added them to his bibliography for good reason. So what I'd like to do then, Mike, and I'm glad to get your opinion on these ideas that I'm going to give here, is I think it's just four broad ideas about building or creating a Divine Council Worldview library. If you're in the business, maybe at the beginning, middle, or even at the end of your library building, I hope these ideas would help you. They're not even really intended, when I think about them looking back, just to create a DCW library. But I'm finding that this is the best way to think about building a library in general, which for me is necessarily DCW oriented, because that's such a critical worldview issue for me. So here we go. Number one, build your library by subject areas. And by that I mean, yes, you want to think in terms of authors. We just mentioned Lewis and how much we like him. But I'm finding that you really have to go by subject areas. So think of where a DCW is created, as it were, in the story of the biblical narrative. Here's the kind of things that I think you need to, as you have opportunity and as your spouse gives you the go ahead to use your funds, to buy books. So there's obviously a well that can run dry pretty quickly when it comes to the price of books. But as you have opportunity, here's what I find helpful for the establishment of my own library. Lexicons, think of the Hebrew language and the Old Testament. So lexicons, grammars, I would try to learn Hebrew as much as possible, because you're going to be depending on, even if it's just a rudimentary knowledge of verb, subject, object, and vocab, those kind of things. Until you feel comfortable seeing a Hebrew word in the commentary you're reading or in the book you're reading, I think it can be daunting. But as you feel comfortable more and more with Hebrew, Mike could sight read it. I recognize it. I don't sight read it, but I can recognize things and see where it's going, in the text. So lexicons, grammars, textual criticism, these are all helpful. Again, background material, Septuagint studies, Dead Sea Scrolls. The more you know, again, about the Hebrew language, the more foundational your DCW will be. Okay. Then you get into ancient Near Eastern thinking, and again, think of, in one sense, this is the last thing a person wants to hear, but if you want to know the Bible, read everything around the Bible, because you want to know the context within which the Bible was written and from which the Bible came. Well, Abraham came from Mesopotamia. He came from Babylon. So he's going to have in his head a Babylonian religion that he's going to be working from as he starts to worship Yahweh, starting in Genesis 12. Going forward, you have to have a Babylonian mindset in order to understand why would Abraham do this, this, and this. I think, in fact, in chapter 22, when God says, go sacrifice your son Isaac, this is my view, Mike, the reason Abraham doesn't say what is because he's seen it before. This is part of the religious practices of his past when it came to Babylonian religion. And so the idea that Yahweh would ask for this, he didn't think at the time it was abnormal even. Now, of course, Yahweh has something to say about that, and he stops it mid-strike. But the idea of why would Abraham act the way he does, I think is, again, going to be informed through his background. So the more you want to know about the Bible, the more you want to know about Mesopotamia, Egypt, Canaan, Ugarit, Hittites, and I'm an easy pushover for any book that has to do with ancient culture outside and around the world of Israel. Then the next category, what I would call ancient religion, comparative mythology. You want to know how people, again, in the biblical world thought. And here are some of the topics. Anything to do with gods, temples, sacred space, kingship, the idea of a king in that day. How did it work? Creation, because every nation has a creation story. Chaos combat, the idea of creation coming out of chaos was a very common idea. The underworld, what happens to people when they die, burial practices, sacrifice, atonement. These are not biblical terms, these are cultural terms. And so my hope someday is that the world, well, again, this is fanciful thinking, Mike, but the idea that when you turn to your friend in church and say, what does it mean to sacrifice, that the first thing we would all think of is not what the Bible says, but what the culture of the biblical era said within which the Bible was written. Because again, the Bible got its view of sacrifice from the culture, probably not God, giving them a manual on what it means to sacrifice. That's my opinion anyway. How about Second Temple Judaism? Now, again, moving left to right through your Bible, once you come to Ezra and Nehemiah, you are entering a period of 400 years or so that's not in between, Malachi and Matthew has a blank page, but there's a lot of history that happens there that informs how to understand the New Testament era. So it sounds unfair, I know, but you cannot understand the New Testament if you don't understand what happened between the Testaments. It's just the way just the way it works. And so, First Enoch, Jubilees, wisdom literature, Philo, Josephus, Qumran, the apocalyptic literature of the era. And there's, again, good books you can purchase that put all these references into one volume. It's nice to have. So much as you can, I would, I'm a glutton for these kind of books because of the background they help us with. Well, then you get into New Testament backgrounds, and the same thing: Greco-Roman religion, emperor cult. What did it mean to worship the emperor as a deity? The word theos will have a different meaning from Elohim because of just the passing of time and the idea that a person could be a theos as part of their world. How'd that happen? Well, that's how you have to study out the emperor cult. Again, gods, demons, angels, angeloi, again in Greek, principalities, powers, archai, exousia, some of these terms, again, that they would have dealt with in their world when it came to the powers, the spiritual powers of their world. The more that you can read on that, the better. Biblical theology. Here's, again, another whole set of thoughts like creation, image of God, Babel, characters like Abraham, Israel, Messiah as a huge concept, again, that you really need to have a background for in order to understand the use of the word Christ in the New Testament. Kingdom, resurrection, new creation. These are theological terms that have an abundance of writings about them, usually from people who are coming at these topics from a certain slant. I understand, we all do. And it's good to know the slant you're reading before you get too deeply involved sometimes. But these are all, again, part of my theological side of my library more than my historical side. I'll say one more thing then to get your opinion here, Mike. When it comes to history of interpretation, like early Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism, how they interpreted their religious books, patristics or the church fathers, and then even medieval exegesis and Reformation studies and things like that, I would put less emphasis on that myself, just because, again, the DCW is going after how the reader and the writer met in a certain culture and thought a certain way. So when it comes to the history of how to interpret that, it's important. You want to hear how people dealt with the text over time. Again, the farther you get away from the original moment of writing the book and reading the book, the farther you get away from that time period, the more possibilities come that they will not be interpreting it properly, right? That's just the way life works. So I don't have a large section of my library devoted to the church fathers. I read them out of curiosity. I was painting my porch the other day, and I had some Audible credits that I could use for free, and I downloaded and listened to First Clement, Ignatius. I forget the books that are included on that list, but Irenaeus. I had several hours to listen, and it was good. I mean, I'm glad I did it. It didn't change my view much of a DCW based on what I was hearing, but it was interesting reading, or interesting listening. Any thoughts on my opening diatribe there, Mike, on building your library by subject areas first?
I mean, I think like your listing here is pretty good. I mean, the only things I probably would also include and maybe recommend to folks is not just only to stay within the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew language, but to expand it out to include also Greek and also Aramaic.
Right.
And I think part of it, and I especially wanted to say the Greek section, because over the years, I think some people have gone into this mode of thinking that, we need to somehow purge the Hellenistic influence from the scriptures, especially from the New Testament. They were all Hebraic, right? Like almost as though you have to get back to the root of it all.
Yeah.
The reality, though, is that the Second Temple period was a hodgepodge of Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, Akkadian. It was a whole bunch of things that were all mixed up together. I mean, if you really want to make it more complicated, there's Coptic and Ethiopian and a whole bunch of other languages that were going on at the time. And so, I think it's a little too simplistic at times that, I'm not saying your list is simplistic. It definitely isn't. But I think some folks go down this route of like, we need to purge out all the Greek pagan influence and not realize that Second Temple Judaism, especially once the exile begins, you don't have a purely Hebraic or pure Hebrew way of thinking anymore, because now they are enmeshed in the culture and philosophy and tools that were made available to them by the Babylonians, right? They're brought into the levels of government. They're brought into the levels of government and function within the Persian government, and so on and so forth. They're exposed to Alexander the Great when he expanded the Greek Empire and to Hellenistic ideas. Like, you cannot get away from the fact that we have essentially, a whole entire category of Second Temple Judaism and even ancient Near East that is not just pure. It is a mixture of things. And the more you're aware of that mixture, the easier it may be for you to slowly discern where these influences are coming from. But and this is actually part of what Mike always meant when he said the matrix of ideas. That phrase of his, of like being aware of what is going on in the air of the culture of any given time, knowing that this is just out there in the thoughts of people, and that there wasn't even one Second Temple Judaism. There was Second Temple Judaisms. There were so many variations and opinions about what was the right way to describe God, or how to worship him, or should we do it in the temple, or should the temple just be gotten rid of? And you had this whole entire hodgepodge of different opinions.
Yeah. Well said. Let's add Greek on my list here.
Yeah. The only other thing that I probably would also encourage folks is, I think sometimes it's because I'm have a little bit of after bitter taste of the whole entire, like, the last couple of years, there was just all this rage about deconstruction. You have to deconstruct everything. And I would just caution that sometimes when we have gone about re-examining our faith, we have done it without any sense of like wisdom or discernment. And I think I have a caution about that, to not just assume that whatever you're reading, that this is absolutely 100% true.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
Right.
Which because I think how to handle things you disagree with.
I think that's just that the importance of discernment is going to be vital and critical, because you're going to read so many of these different things. This was a part of why, like, especially once the materials from like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Nimrod, all this stuff started being unearthed, you had within the Christian scholarship world split into two, where you had one side that was completely, the Bible just simply copied everything from all of the other cultures. And then you had another side that just wanted to ignore and pretend that it didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason why we even had that split was because no one wanted to try to exercise or attempt to discern. And it was just more of like, I just want to give into one camp or the other and not realize there's a lot of gray in the middle.
And that leads me to my second point. Well said. Here's how I'd say it. Watch for authors cited in Heiser's footnotes. Start here. If you want to know where to go within some of these larger subjects, here's what I would do. I would get his expanded edition or his other books and watch, or just any of his books, actually. You don't have to get the expanded Unseen Realm. Look at the footnotes. Look at the names that are at the bottom of the page. Again, not to say that Mike got everybody that you could get in there, but that's probably the best example of a DCW list of names that you're going to be seeing. So let me read let me read what I have here. This will lead you to scholars who do not necessarily share Heiser's evangelical theology. Hardly any of them do, but whose philological, historical, or comparative works supplied much of the evidentiary foundation for, in Mike's case, his understanding of a DCW, and I know for my sake, the same thing. In other words, you don't share necessarily a theological affinity for some of these names I'll list, but they are helpful for various reasons. And so names, I think, are valuable. And I have gotten myself into the bad habit of when someone says, what should I read? I just say everything, which in one sense I want to say all. I mean, I've always felt that way, that the best thing to read is anything you can get your hands on. But I understand the question. The honesty of the questioner is, well, I got to start somewhere. So give me some background, some names to work with. I will not, for time, just go through my list of names. Again, if you can see my screen, you see them there. Richard Hess, Mark Smith, Frank Moorcross, and on it goes. I include in this list, again, not people who I agree with on everything. That's not the point. Mike obviously didn't agree with everybody on this list by any means. In fact, most of them, there's something in their writings that would even say, no, I'm not on the DCW bandwagon at all. N.T. Wright's on our list. Excellent writer. I would read everything. I think I've read everything he's written. I've devoured it as soon as it comes out. He's the kind of writer that I literally set aside, coffee shop time for, get up at 4 a.m. and just spend 3 hours with his latest book, because he's that good. I would definitely do that with him. I've done that with a lot of the names on here. Ben Witherington, Michael Bird, Amy Jo Levine, other ones that I just, when I see something come out by them, Richard Bauckham. Again, not evangelicals, most of them. None of them are purely DCW. And again, what I mean by that is none of them, would I say, are, well, let me read what I have at the bottom of my screen. That kind of catches my point. These authors certainly do not constitute a unified DCW school, quote unquote, and most do not support a DCW understanding of Scripture. Your goal here, when I talk of these names, and here's how I think of it, your goal is to create a network of scholarly conversations, not a collection of favorite DCW authors. If you're trying to collect DCW authors, you're kind of stuck with Mike. There's not a lot of, authors out there. Joel Muddamalle just came out. There it is. I have it on my
with Unseen Battle,
here.
Right?
Yeah, Joel Muddamalle, The Unseen Battle, published through Zondervan, just came out. I'd recommend it. Dr. Mike worked with Joel on that book, and that certainly would be a DCW author, Joel Muddamalle. But when it comes to others that are in the profession, the scholarly world, you can pretty much bet there's going to be something in their writings that you'll find disagreement with, but that's just the way it is. I mean, you can't, if we all agreed, someone's not thinking, as I like to say. So anything you want to add to my second point had to do with authors. My first point was subjects. The second point is, well, what authors do I look for? Mostly people, for me, it's people who are dealing with background material, history of religion. When I look at my list here, it's social issues dealing in biblical times. What else can I say about them? They care about the text more than a denominational spin. I would say it that way. They're very textual driven, most of these writers that I'm looking at here.
Well, I mean, if I would summarize, like many of these guys, I would highly recommend as well, like John Godengay, Daniel Block, John Hilber. Absolutely love Hilber's work on relevant theory. And so like that kind of stuff is helpful. And I think the unifying factor about all these authors is that they're not, like you said, they're not DCW. I wouldn't even use the label DCW. They're generally authors and scholars that focus on the actual ancient historical background, right, of the either the Hebrew or the Greek text, knowing what the culture, the background, the stories that are going about, what is going on in the culture in the day when these writings were put down onto parchment. And I think that's one of the things that is helpful to understand from that kind of scholarly consensus. It's not that any of these would agree with the concept of, yes, the gods exist today and they have some sort of influence on the world. Some of them, maybe a lot of them would say absolutely not. Like, right. Those gods don't really exist, but they will go as far to acknowledge, but the people who wrote the scriptures and who lived and breathed the air of the culture around them believed that. So at the very least, we can come to that agreement. And they had to factor that type of relevance in their research and writing. And so it is something why it's worthwhile actually still reading from authors that may not have evangelical, less alone even maybe Christian convictions. It's just simply they are interested in understanding the historical background and the culture of the day of the writers.
Yep. Yeah, and you make a good point. I think I have Jacob Neusner on here. Yes, he's Jewish. Mm-hmm. He's not even a Christian. Bruce
or
Chilton.
Alan Siegel.
Alan Siegel, good. Bruce Chilton, is he Christian or Jewish? I always forget. Certainly many of these are not evangelical. I'd say most of them are
Jacob
not.
Neusner, I don't think, right?
Yeah, Neusner is Jewish. Yep. And so let's add that to our point here, that don't ever buy or read an author based on their evangelical convictions. I've gotten beyond that stage. In fact, well, let me go to my next point, and I'll kind of come around the other side. Prioritize primary sources whenever possible. DCW becomes most persuasive if you're like a Sunday school teacher or pastor and you want to encourage, or just want to encourage your own pastor on believing a DCW, trusting in DCW ideas. You could hand them Mike's book. I understand that's a good way to start, and in fact, many have done that with good success. What I would always or ultimately aim to do is, and of course, Dr. Heiser was all about this. You're trying to explain this not in terms of it being new and creative. Horrors, no. You're trying to explain it in the sense that this is where the primary sources always were going anyway. This is where the Bible itself was aiming towards. So if you can even avoid, I'm not saying don't give Mike's book to people, but I'm saying if you could give or start speaking from the primary sources themselves, it would give even a stronger basis for DCW issues, because you're showing that you're going back to the material. So a DCW becomes most persuasive when ancient texts prioritize themselves over modern scholarship. You're not just giving someone a book by, Michael Bird. You're actually going to the text itself. Today, we are blessed with many excellent English translations of basic texts. And so when it comes to learning Ugaritic and learning Akkadian, go ahead and do it if you have the time. We are blessed, though, with many good English translations today. Even in the last 50 years, I mean, we are so blessed compared to the world before us when it comes to being able to do independent research in your own library at home. When it comes to the Hebrew Bible, by the way, I'd always, the first Old Testament I would look at, I would use the Jewish Publication Society version of your Old Testament because it has good footnotes, and they know their Bible better than, if I hate to say it, but I'm going to be honest, they know their Bible better than we do. They know their Hebrew Bible better than we do. And so, again, Augustine, the father of most of our denominational, background, didn't know Hebrew. So the very beginning of most of our traditions when it comes to the Christian inertia really getting going in the 3rd to 4th century with Augustine, it was coming from a man who didn't really care much about the Old Testament at all. So for my sake, I like to go back to the primary source of the Old Testament to get things going. And to do that, I would have a Jewish Bible with me. Otherwise, I'm not going to read these, but just realize going back to primary sources is very valuable. The standard right now for reading a collection of religious texts of surrounding pagan authors or nations is Hallow and Younger. It's called The Context of Scripture, and I would get it in the electronic version. I know Accordance has it. I'm sure Logos has it as well. Mm-hmm. That kind of research book or volume, it's huge, really can only be used, in my estimation, if you do it electronically, because it's just too massive, and you can search for what you're looking for. If you want to just read it, you can do that too. But some of these massive works that are, again, available to us for the first time, we have English translations of some of these texts. I would get the electronic version of those kind of books. Anything else to say here?
Well, can I maybe do? If I can also I wouldn't discourage people from reading the Jewish Publication Society's version, but I would caution. Well, I don't know if caution is the right word. It might be too strong to say it that way. But I would say that one does need to be aware that the JPS is writing from a perspective that is going to lean a little bit more on medieval rabbinic interpretation.
Okay.
Right.
Compared to what?
I think, compared to like the NET, I think that like the New English translation that is a little bit, that one I would probably recommend a little bit more so, just because it is drawing a lot more of like biblical study material. Like there's less, ironically, there's a less of a Jewish rabbinic, perspective, because we're just going to look at the textual material and the ancient Near Eastern sources around the Bible. The reason I mention it is because recently, a few weeks ago, there was a question that was brought up about that was sent actually to Awakening. And I had to dig into this about like, how did the JPS understand Psalm 82? Yeah. And apparently, I think there was a commentary note that said something along the lines that it believed that these were just simply, human kings that were being called Elohim. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, interesting. Apparently, that's a little bit of an artifact of some of the medieval rabbinic kind of thinking that developed and just essentially just kind of got codified and stayed that way.
Yeah.
And so, I would just kind of mention, because I also remember Mike oftentimes would get frustrated whenever people would mention, well, the rabbis said this. Yeah. in his opinion, is like, why are we going back to the rabbis when they started making their commentaries and their thoughts known by around the 500, 600, 700 AD era?
Yeah, good point.
They're like so far removed. Their interpretation is just as bad as medieval Christian interpretation.
Yeah. And I should clarify. Let me clarify then. When I say my Jewish study Bible, I can't get it from where I'm sitting. Let me clarify. That's a good point to be made, Mike. I trust the footnotes or the commentary as much as I trust the NET, the ESV. What are the other Bibles I have up there? And so what I'm aiming for is the Hebrew text's translation, just the translation of the Hebrew text. And it doesn't Christianize things too quickly, right? That's what I don't want it to do. I don't want my Bible Christianizing things before they need to be or should be. There is a story being told in Scripture, and you do get to Jesus eventually, but to have a Bible that puts too much too soon, that's what I'm arguing against, I guess I'd say. Mm-hmm. All right, number 4, and we'll close with this. Learn from authors who disagree with the DCW and why. Authors like Mark Smith are enormously valuable precisely because their historical reconstruction of Israelite religion differs significantly from, again, to bring up Dr. Heiser, his theological reconstruction. If you put Mark Smith and Dr. Heiser together or side by side, you're going to see some interesting issues that matter to both of them, but they come out on very different stories or planes or argumentation issues when it comes to the final analysis. So it just realize that when you read an author and you let's say personally find yourself disagreeing with them for some reason, it's not a good reason. That doesn't mean you set them aside. That means you keep reading and you try to understand why do you disagree with them, and that's the way to really hone your DCW thinking, is to know why people would disagree with even your own views on things or Dr. Heiser's views. So that's my 4th point here, is that learn to disagree well and to even buy or at least read or be aware of arguments that again, you don't agree with. So when it comes to my own Bibles or study Bibles that I keep handy, I know that if I were to pull the Reformation Study Bible off my shelf right now, Reformation Study Bible by R.C. Sproul or General Editor R.C. Sproul, I know he's not going to agree with me on Psalm 82. But it's good to have it there and to put, to open it up. The MacArthur Study Bible right next to it. I know what Dr. MacArthur is going to say. I taught, under him or at that school for a couple of years. I know that world. I'm familiar with how they think. I appreciate it. That's my tribe. That's where I come from. At the same time, I don't agree with necessarily everything that's there. So I'm just saying it's not a reason to not read it, but just be aware that sometimes reading what you disagree with can be very helpful for strengthening your own understanding in the end. So Let me read my last sentence or last half of this. I therefore would not maintain a list of authors to avoid because they disagree with Heiser. I would avoid, or at least quarantine, another category, and that would be writers whose books are driven by denominational tradition over primary texts. Once I hear, and that's why some of the names that you may have been expecting to see on my big list are not there. I'm not going to get into the specific names, but there are some names that I don't read them anymore because I know what they believe. I've been around the block enough that I know that if I pick that book off the shelf and I read it, I know the story he's going to be telling. And I'm familiar with that story. I've been through that story myself. I used to teach that story or whatever. And now that I disagree with it, I know why I disagree with it, and I don't need to go back and rehash it by reading that author again. So there are some authors that I don't buy today. It's not because, well, it's because I know what they think, and I'm shall I say, I'm past needing that now for where I'm going. Or, and this is another one that, again, I might offend some or stub some toes on this. I don't buy books whose interest is devotional application over original meaning. I would much rather, for me, this is just where I am, Mike. I would rather have a book grapple with the original meaning of the original text than just apply the Bible to me. Because again, this is just me. And I know C.S. Lewis talked about this in one of his books. I forget where it is, but having books tell me how to apply the Bible to myself, I just don't find that helpful anymore. I've got plenty to deal with just the Bible itself. And so that's where I am. Where are you on the issue of devotional reading?
I don't generally buy it for myself anymore. I mean, like, I don't seek that type of material out as much anymore. Like the authors that were used to be on my bookshelf that I was proud of like 20 years ago, they pretty much have now migrated into a storage box, just because my interests have shifted. But I would also understand why there is a drive, especially, as I've been becoming more and more comfortable in the role of being a teaching pastor. I do understand why people are drawn to it because, and I totally get what you mean about wanting to understand the original meaning, but I also understand from a person that's coming into the faith or coming to know Christ for the first time, there is a wide gap in for me being now about 33 decades in as being a Christian. And so now I have about 3 decades worth of experience and lived out experience and reading and my own personal study that I have under this whole entire thing that's basically part of my discernment, right? Like I can do this type of study and I can figure out immediately, well, now I know what this original meaning of the text is saying. I know how for my life, I can apply it to my life, right? Like, cause I can see the connection points and what I would need to do, what convictions it brings out in me. But for a person that is still very green with reading the scriptures, I can see why they grapple with, well, how's this relevant to me? Right? Like that they don't necessarily see the connection point. They can appreciate the data, they can appreciate the content, but they may not understand immediately, how do I bridge what I'm understanding, you're telling me what the original meaning is, to the fact that I really hate my job right now. I don't know if I really want to just leave and just become a used car salesman, right? Like they're grappling with issues that really which really takes more of their mental processing day to day. And I think, I don't know, I think this has just been part of why I have appreciated the fact that all these things that I've been involved with, like I'm still keeping a foot very much in the academic and like teaching world and, awakening. But then also, every Sunday and even throughout the week, I've been interacting more with people who are from my church and they're dealing with life stuff. And I'm trying to find a way of taking the stuff that I love, which is the ancient Near East Second Temple material, DCW, ancient Near East stuff, and find a way to make that as a connecting point. It somehow show there's a relevance to it, to folks in my church. And more often than not, I've been figuring out how to do that more, but I recognize the challenge. And I think that's just why I see and I appreciate that there is devotional application out there, because for some folks, they need that help. And there's only one of me. There's only so much one person or one pastor can do in that miss. And so I don't think there's anything wrong for wherever maturity level one is at with one's faith. Go with what can encourage and build your faith up and grow into, deeper study, grow into and become more used to, okay, let me look at what our Bible translations say about this passage. Let me see, let me see what the NLT says instead of just always relying on the ESV, for example, and just start getting out there to realize there's different ways of approaching the text and seeing how even the text could be translated.
Yeah. Thank you. I would say, and I agree with where you're coming from, when it comes to devotional literature. Just remember, everyone, and I just say this to our audience as a whole, every time you pick up a book and open up a book, you're reading, you're jumping into a theology. That person, that author, he or she has a theology in place that they're now going to expound or apply devotionally to you. And they probably won't tell you what the story they're working with is, right? Fair enough. They're going to be presuming you agree with them on their version of the story they're telling. So just be aware of that. And yeah, thanks for nothing. But that to me is a important issue that people just need to realize, that that's the challenge of reading a book of any stripe, is that the author presumes you know what story they're telling even before you open the book, and you're jumping into a book usually, or jumping into an idea that's quite baked into that story. So, all right, I think we're good. Thank you, Mike. Let's close it up for this one, this episode. And any questions you have, folks, about your library, or what books to buy? And there's so much we didn't cover, by the way, when it comes to buying versus Audible you can listen to, or Kindle, electronic issues. Logos and Accordance, of course, are incredibly helpful. We really should spend an entire episode someday on how to create or use Accordance and Logos in the DCW model, because there's so much there as well. But that's for another time. So, Closing thoughts. Otherwise,
I would encourage folks as well to, I've actually met some of the folks who listen to our podcast at ETS and SBL. So I would recommend, if you happen to be at this, live or near the city wherever those conferences are showing up, even just coming by and just buying a day pass for one day and just dropping in on the different seminars, it would be also very, very helpful.
I found that more helpful than you'll ever know. When I was a young, whippersnapper coming out of Bible college or seminary and starting to teach, I had not met these authors, obviously, and they were names on a book to me. But to go to these conferences and to sit in their lectures and to then have coffee with some of them, you found out that they're normal people. They're grandpas and grandmas as well. I mean, they have normal lives, and they are, many of them, very godly people. And they may not even have your denominational stripe or tradition, but some of them are, many of them that I've met are hopelessly godly people that are very committed to Christ. And it just happens to be that they teach at Yale. And you don't, you wouldn't associate the school they're teaching at with a Christian flavor, but they happen themselves to be very, very Christian people. So,
yeah, I would say, just even those conversations, many of these scholars, they have a sense of their knowledge and expertise level is it is really just at a different level where it is just coming out of them without them even being conscious about it. Right? I still to this day, even on the last day of ETS, I had a chat with just a brief moment of talking with Peter Gentry. And he just like blurted out this side comment simply about how that you always had a meal after a covenant is signed or established. It's like, why? Well, it's because a meal, you only have meals with family. And when you have a covenant with another family, you're essentially saying, we are now one family, and thus we will share a meal together because families eat together. Mm-hmm. And then that one little insight of his has like played out in my own kind of like study and work for the last couple of years, even to the point that we're planning a sermon series around that concept of seeing that appearing throughout the narrative of Scripture, of how important that concept of God wants a family. How do we see that? And how is that expressed? Oh, interestingly enough, we have so many meals going on in the Scriptures. Mm-hmm. So it is just kind of one of those things. It's just, you never know what will happen just in those kind of brief encounters and conversations with scholars on that kind of level. And they're not even doing it on purpose. It just ekes out of them because they're so immersed in that scholarly research and world.
I've got a friend that does not hesitate to email well-known scholars whenever he's got a question, and he gets answers back from them. And I never thought of that, but today you can do that. The old days, you could write a letter, but now, you can email these people and just give it a shot and see if they return your thoughts. So, all right. Well, thank you, Mike. Let's close it up for this edition of the Divine Council Worldview podcast. Have a blessed week, everyone. And until we talk again, may God expand your library in a good way. Bye-bye.